Hey, Spark Cricketeers! Welcome to part 2, the delayed part 2 on the series on Liana Kerzner. This deals with Liana Kerzner in conflict because it's important. One thing that will help you understand Liana and how she portrays conflict is to look at her past and just how often she portrays an extremely inaccurate and biased rendition of conflict. This is relevant to us right now because of what we are exposing and how she is responding. So, we do have records of the things she has said about the people that she has come into conflict with and how she has portrayed the conflict and the people afterwards. This will tell you whether she's a reliable narrator and whether her account of people can be trusted at all or not. But why am I starting with Gail Simone instead of the PAX incident, which is the first incident on the website? Well, because out of all of the once close associates that she's had a falling out with, Gail Simone is the one that has the largest audience, the reach, and the biggest fame. So you're going to see a lot of similarities in the conflict itself in the event that led to the break, but then you're going to see something very different in how she handles that break afterwards. I'll posit that this is because Gail Simone is beloved by a great deal of fans and she has a body of work that has canonized her as a respected writer in the comic book industry. Doing to Gail Simone what she has done to Asher and myself and other people who don't have that reach would be career suicide in so many different ways. So she handles things a little bit differently, but in some very important aspects, not that differently. So, brief overview of the relationship. We do have verifiable timelines. Liana's friendship with Gail Simone predates my friendship with her by many years. When I met Liana, I wasn't really aware of the nature or extent of that association. I had no idea that Liana Kerzner was a character in the DC universe because the books I gravitate towards are Wonder Woman, the Titans, and a few others, but I've never been much of a Batman reader. So I didn't read the Secret Six books. I knew of Gail Simone primarily for turning Barbara Gordon into Oracle and for her Wonder Woman run, which I consider one of the best the character has had after George Perez's reboot. So, at some point in their relationship, they were close enough that Simone wrote Kerzner into the Secret Six canon as an official character. Liana Kerzner, Scandal Savage's girlfriend and then later co-spouse. Fictional Liana Kerzner is in a polyamorous relationship with Scandal Savage and Knockout. Liana and I spoke very little about Gail Simone in the early years. The first substantive mention occurred on July 14, 2019, when I pointed out that Gail Simone had found a tweet by Mike Barron insulting her, calling her a fat, bitter cat lady. On other occasions, my references to Gail Simone were limited to praising her, particularly for that Wonder Woman run. But in August of 2019, Kerzner's responses to mentions of Gail were mostly neutral. But by 2020, though, something had changed. When I showed Kerzner a Twitter exchange in which Simone was involved, and which I had also participated, her response differed sharply. It was very bitter. Quote, "Funny, Gail Simone told me off for saying the same thing. Fuck you, Gail. You used to be a human being, not a social justice warrior." Liana said that Gail Simone had told her off, but I didn't ask where or how this happened. It certainly wasn't visible on Twitter. I could not see any public confrontation between the two of them, and Liana hadn't mentioned an interaction like that during the earlier discussions of Simone since I started to talk to her. Now, in the 2 years that we had known each other at that point, I knew that if something had happened, she would have told me because she has a tendency to recount conflicts close to the time that they occur, as you will see. Liana has a tendency to rewrite the past, especially when she feels slighted or rejected. Following this statement, though, Liana speculated about Gail Simone's mental health. Over time, I have seen a recurring rhetorical pattern in Liana's conversations. When expressing hostility towards an individual, she will usually employ language framing that individual in the trappings of mental health stigma. She will include phrases such as profoundly mentally ill. She used that language in her reference to Gail Simone in a conversation involving a third party on March 16, 2020. Quote, "Gail comes from a family with profound mental illness. Comic skate set her off the deep end. She talks tough online but is actually very shy and easily wounded. She should have stepped away but instead kept arguing with them." I wasn't an observer in these conversations, and unfortunately at times I agreed with Liana's assessment because I extended a level of trust in her that proved to be misplaced. So misplaced. The interesting thing, though, is that Liana also expressed a certain level of resentment regarding how her fictional namesake was establishing relationships within the Secret Six. On April 6, 2021, she said, Also, yeah, Gail did not tell me about the polyamory part, and I could have been pretty pissed at that, but why would anyone get pissed off about that? The emphasis that I've added is mine to reflect the all caps that she was writing with for those words, which indicate that, yeah, she was pissed off about it, and there was an implication that anyone would be pissed off about it. It was very strange. This is a fictional namesake character loosely based on her, but it almost feels like she's treating that character as essentially her own self. It is relevant context because, in videos following Liana's falling out with Poppy Diabolique, which has remained largely unaddressed publicly by her, Liana repeatedly has expressed disapproval of polyamorous relationships. She later attempted to publicly shame my husband and me for our non-monogamous relationship in that Twitter diatribe. So, over time, I came to question Liana's repeated claims that she speaks openly and promptly when conflict arises. It's not the case at all. Liana allows resentment to accumulate until it builds up to a head, and then when the opportunity arises, there's a decisive rupture which then she reframes as entirely justified and the other party is always at fault. This happened to Gail Simone on January 22nd, 2022. A month before Stephen Kerzner, yes, according to Liana's own words, accessed $3,000 from the Kickstarter funds without authorization. Liana sent me the following message via Telegram. Well, that's it. With me and Gail Simone, she's gone total SJW now. The exchange followed the public Twitter interaction in which Simone responded to one of Liana's tweets, where she said that it is interesting how many people say that being ignored is better than being harassed. Gail disagreed with Liana in that public conversation. At one point, Gail said that she disagreed with Liana on a molecular level, and this very much seems to have bothered Liana a great deal. At which point, the conversation moved into direct messages. Now, before I show you the exchange, I need to tell you that I found the exchange very confusing, and I noted this explicitly to her. I said to Liana that I was asking whether there was an unspoken issue underlying the disagreement, like something that had not been said that was lingering from the past. Liana didn't respond to that question. Now, Liana states routinely that she is not qualified to diagnose mental health conditions, that she's not a therapist, and that is correct. Nevertheless, in private and public conversations, she frequently engages in speculative mental health framing of individuals with whom she is in conflict. If you look at the exchange, it is a very strange exchange. The way that several friends have put it, it's almost like Gail Simone was railroaded into a conversation that could only have one particular outcome, no matter what she did. Instead of this being, I'm going to use gaming terms, a choose-your-own-adventure game where different outcomes could have arisen from different choices, Gail Simone was basically trapped on a shooter on rails, and that shooter was Panzer Dragoon 2. Several times you can see Liana trying to rephrase Gail's arguments into being something entirely different, and Gail corrects Liana to the point that she gets fed up and says that she is not going to accept having a nefarious intent ascribed to her. Gail Simone handled herself with aplomb and grace and dignity, and in some cases with elegance, in this conversation. Liana was anything but, and when Gail saw a huge red flag, Simone disengaged. As I understand it, this was the ending of their friendship. The difference, of course, between this conversation and the conversation with Asher is that Asher was desperately trying to salvage the relationship. The exchange was unsettling to me because it appeared to escalate rapidly, and it left very little room for resolution. From my perspective, Liana's framing carries implications that were not explicitly stated, but they make disagreement functionality impossible with her, short of 100% full agreement. There is no path forward. No other response from Gail Simone would have de-escalated the situation or salvaged their relationship except 100% agreement. And I realize now that this is more or less by design. This is what I call the Kerzner trap. Simone disengaged just as she should have. Now, at the time, I chalked my confusion to my limited knowledge of the prior relationship between these two, but it appears likely that an unresolved grievance existed prior to this exchange. But Liana never spoke about it out loud to Simone. Because if you look at the 5-year relationship with Asher in his Telegram history, Liana has claimed that she confronted us multiple times. That never happened. And you can see that in that conversation log with Asher over 5 years. Liana may have wanted potentially to confront him at some point, may have even played out the confrontation in her mind, but it doesn't mean that it happened. Asher has said that what Liana doesn't tell you will hurt you, and that is true, because Liana places secret timers in her mind that eventually go off. At the time, I didn't really look further into this, but I should have. Because once I sat down after the Sparkle fucking and started looking over the timeline, I discovered some additional context that really alters the interpretation of January 22nd. I was right, though, insofar as there being a prior incident. I just didn't really know how prior it had been, because 2 years earlier, on January 20th, 2020, almost 2 years to the date, Liana had already raised that same issue with Gail Simone on Twitter. She said, "It's better to be harassed than ignored. Discuss." In hindsight, it appears plausible that the later exchange functioned as an attempt to provoke a more definite confrontation with Gail after that initial opposition to the framing 2 years earlier. Now remember, Liana claimed that Simone had turned her into public enemy number one, but despite the absence of any public denunciations by Simone, there's no commentary, there's no blasting. To my knowledge, Gail Simone did not reference Liana Kerzner publicly again after that Twitter exchange. In July 19th, remember, Liana said, "Gail Simone turned me into public enemy number one, and she should have known better. She knows me. And Gail, honey, you worked with Ethan Van Sciver when everyone told you what he was about. Pot, kettle." Liana herself discussed this matter in her semi-public Discord server that you can access for $1 on Patreon. On January 18th, she claimed, "He even threw Gail Simone going nuts on me in my face." This is on January 18th, 2025. In that same exchange, Kubu, the user, said, "I don't like Gail Simone. She tends to nerd bait way too often." At which point Liana replied, "Apparently some of her fans pressured her heavily to denounce me over the name Lady Bits. Have they read her writing? That's tame." Now, here's the interesting thing. I've never seen that denunciation. If you look at Gail Simone's exchanges, even when Mike Barron called her a bitter fat cat lady, Gail didn't do what Liana does. She didn't turn it into an opera. Mike Barron, despite being still largely obscure nowadays, does have notoriety in the comic sphere because he is the creator of The Badger and Nexus, and he wrote The Punisher, among other comics. So insofar as nerd standing goes, Mike Barron is still far more visible than Liana Kerzner has ever been. So, Gail Simone did not denounce someone like that. How on earth are we to believe that Gail Simone denounced Liana Kerzner, a small-time, relatively speaking YouTuber with a web series that doesn't have nearly the same reach as one of Gail Simone's comics, or even one of Mike Barron's comics? Why would Gail Simone spend the time, the breath, or the energy to denounce Liana Kerzner over the name of a gaming history YouTube show? Liana makes these claims about smears and announcements all the time, but where are they? Liana is telling you a story that doesn't really match what we can see, nor the character of the person. So you see there, apparently Gail denounced Liana, but then in an event earlier, before I mentioned anything about Gail Simone, because I didn't. I'm starting to speak up about Gail Simone, and it's 2026. In 2024, Liana dragged Gail Simone in December while doing one of her typical "I am the victim of everything" routines. Quote, "I lost a lot of friends over Gamergate and Comicsgate, including Gail Simone, who was bullied into turning on me." December 29th, 2024. So, here she's directly accusing Gail Simone of being a proxy for bullies. I want you to keep that in mind. Look at the date, right? That's before I started speaking up, and I had not mentioned Gail Simone and that exchange in public at all. So, why is she being mentioned? In January of 2025, in order to paint herself as a victim, she was telling the server about how I threw Gail Simone in her face. Let's go back to that exchange though, because it's interesting. Why did she say it that way? Why did she mention that in such an offhand fashion that would essentially imply that her server understood that there was already an underlying narrative about Gail Simone in her server, right? Notice that nobody in that server went, "Gail Simone went nuts at you? Oh my God, what happened?" No, that already implies that there's a larger working narrative about Gail Simone in that server. This aligns to the broader pattern that you can observe across multiple incidents with Liana. Liana will make reputationally damaging statements about individuals to semi-public audiences that she controls, while also supplementing those statements through private communications that include additional personal or speculative information, including mental health stigma. Because I have found no public record of Gail Simone discussing her mother's alleged mental health issues. But once animosity develops, Liana does not treat prior communications as confidential, but she treats any disclosure of her private communications as betrayal. In my assessment, the only effective way to counteract the pattern that Kerzner uses is to document it with primary evidence and then show what she does, which is what I'm doing. Because Liana's audience has accepted a materially incomplete and misleading account of events, which Then they appear to accept without challenge and then most likely disseminate. A well-established comic creator has been framed as a bully to an audience comprised largely of clients of Kerzner who most of the time are fans of the properties that Simone herself works in. Liana's large Discord server functions as a paid platform. It's not a closed social circle. Now, Liana is very good at trying to reframe and to try to change wording. She may argue that she was referring to a different and more damaging exchange with Gail Simone. Should she advance that claim, context doesn't really support it, because in the screenshots in which Kerzner asserts that I threw Gail Simone for going nuts in her face, she's referencing the interaction that Liana and I had over the big ugly fight. And in the big ugly fight, I mentioned that particular instance of Gail Simone that Liana forwarded to me. Now, as I mentioned, what she did to Asher was very much what happened with Gail Simone, except that Asher did not disengage and terminate the friendship until it was too late. My comparison to her argument with Simone was made for that reason. The difference between the two isn't the pattern or conduct. At this point, and in the next examples that we will see, Liana's conduct is always the same. The outcome is what's different, because Gail Simone disengaged when it became clear that the interaction was not going to be reciprocal, and she had the power to be immune and exempt from a smear campaign. Asher sought to preserve their relationship and continued engaging. The fact that Liana has not done an open smear campaign on Gail Simone, like she has done with Asher and me and others, in Song, for example, is because Asher and I have a much smaller audience than Gail Simone. That does indicate that, once again, Liana Kerzner punches down, and she treats substantial disagreements as a betrayal of her own identity, which inevitably ends in a permanent rupture. It is telling that when I mention in public that she can't stand disagreements, the only example she could reach for in her server was the fact that she became friends with Aileen when she disagreed with one of Liana's takes on the Avengers. The Avengers. This is like saying that my tolerance for disagreement is exemplified by me still being friends with someone who thinks the Thundercats suck, but it is actually indicative of the level and kind of disagreements that Liana Kerzner considers tolerable. And it is enormously tragic how shallow that pool is. She claims that she has the opposite problem, and tolerance of disagreements is something that she has too much of. Well, you're about to embark on a roller coaster ride that shows that that's not the case. I think it's pretty clear from the context that Liana Kerzner considers Gail Simone disagreeing with her and then refusing to 100% agree with her in the conversation afterwards as Gail Simone going nuts on her. And that was the cardinal sin from which everything else stemmed. Just like when I said that I had observed intentional cruelty in her handling of Asher, Liana Kerzner treated that as a cardinal sin beyond any forgiveness. And essentially, well, you've seen what's happened. Of course, in my opinion. But I think that I can substantiate that opinion with all of the things that I have posted. Touch base for a second here. Liana Kerzner has essentially spread some reputational damage to Gail Simone in a pay-to-access server because of a disagreement, painting her as a bully by proxy. That's not being tolerant of disagreement, that is in fact the exact opposite. But let's check on Liana today to see what she's doing in response to the evidence so far. Oh god, she's wilding out there. In this skeet, Liana is saying, quote, "I love it when people tell on themselves. She betrayed a confidence, she traumatized me, but it's totally fine that I tried to humiliate and smear her dozens of times because I was upset. I'm a truth teller. Every accusation is a confession. The more they talk, the stronger the Darvo gets." Truth teller? Is she trying to talk about Asher or about trans truth teller? It's a bit telling there, isn't it? But this actually is tied to something she said on her Feedback Friday, where she croaked out, and I say croaked out because she is actually suffering from laryngitis. Go look at that video, incidentally, and listen to it. That is what Liana Kerzner sounds like when she has laryngitis. This will become pertinent in the next video. But in that video, among some of the other ridiculous claims that she made, she claims that we are complaining of too much disclosure and not enough disclosure. Now, yeah, that is a ridiculous position, isn't it? When you see someone take a position like that, What are you going to think? But that's an irrational person. They're not in touch with reality. Yeah, that is by design. Liana employs this sophistical device, which is called the dropped context, in which she flattens an entire situation, and by removing details can manipulate those details, the details that remain around, enough to paint a person in a bad image. In fact, what Liana did is actually a very old trick. You can actually disclose too much of one thing so that you can distract from the fact that you did not disclose enough from another. It's a sleight of hand trick that I've already pointed before, where she was trying to manipulate the language around the Kickstarter funds. Let's add the context that she gleefully removed. We are complaining, insofar as disclosure, that she disclosed items and details that were not for her to disclose to the public, and which were of no public interest whatsoever, such as the details of our marriage, my husband's mental health conditions, or the fact that Liana was trusted by my husband with the disclosure of the traumatic sexual event that occurred to him when he was a child. And then Liana, in January of 2025, essentially listed those details inaccurately to her server in order to mock my husband. I will repeat. Liana Kerzner repeated distorted details of my husband's sexual trauma from his childhood to her server in order to mock him. She has proceeded to repeat this by repeating those distorted details on social media, then claiming that my husband wrote about them, that that's what was in his article, when those details are absent from the article. In fact, the article mentions no details at all. We also complain that she has betrayed the confidences of her Liana Cares clients, to whom she is contractually obligated, as she has stated that she signs a privacy and confidentiality form with her clients. So, by sharing Mitchell Jura's personal details, such as his real-life name, his social media, mental health history, and family history to my husband, she violated that agreement. Likewise, when she shared screenshots of the conversation with Giant Enemy Crab, who was a client of her at the time and who was asking for an emergency Christmas session. Or when she paraded Song's trauma in front of her audience, who gleefully mocked it in her Discord server. Now I ask you, shouldn't we be fully justified in objecting to that? I believe that if you were in those positions, you yourself would most likely be pissed off. What are we complaining was not disclosed? Well, for example, if Liana Kerzner intended to blame the project delays on my husband's mental health and the delays that it caused me, then she should be honest enough to also disclose her delays that were caused by, according to her husband's mental health issues. Because that is just. The fact that Liana Kerzner has not done so and instead keeps trying to double down on the narrative that came out tells you everything you need to know about her. Or also complaining about the lack of disclosure of the fact that her husband accessed $3,000 of the Kickstarter funds without authorization or even legal authority to do so, and that the backers were not notified, and that to this day she keeps lying about it and trying to obscure the facts, even though she very clumsily essentially admitted to it. So yes, if you decide to move to the planet Marva, where they have no context, and you look at the situation, we must look like very, very silly people who complain about disclosure and non-disclosure. But here in planet Earth, when we have to look at context, it is actually perfectly understandable. She doesn't want you to actually see that we have a point for saying what we say. And you should start asking yourself why that is. Especially since she has started now slipping into diagnostic language. Now, I need to emphasize that to be a peer counselor in Canada, you do not need any certification. You don't need any licensing. You freaking should, but you don't. Because Peer counselors cannot diagnose and they cannot write prescriptions, etc. Well, that's not stopping Liana Kerzner, because here you see in these skeets, she is essentially implying that we are narcissists, that we're doing this for clout or attention or selfish motivations. It's kind of wilding here, because then she uses Psych Central, a pop psychology article on narcissism, to prop her argument. This is the same Liana Kerzner who made 2 episodes about narcissism and it's not therapy, warning people not to label people narcissists, by the way. But, I mean, by this point, you really should not be shocked that this woman contradicts herself so often. She exists in the Schrodinger space at this point. And insofar as that claim that we are complaining that she disclosed information and that one of us was traumatized, but we were happy to humiliate her and smear her for months, what are the smears? She does this a lot. She uses extremely vague language, very vague and emotional language. Asher and I have been telling you what she's done for months, and now, even more so with all of the evidence that we have carefully amassed and verified to make sure that it was documented. We have told you what Liana Kerzner does. She sees that as a smear. But Liana Kerzner cannot tell you what the smears are, what the humiliation is, except maybe telling to the world what it is that she did when she expects you to stay quiet about it. And why should you stay quiet about it? So that she can continue to do this to other people who don't have the resources or the audience of a Gail Simone to escape a smear campaign or to escape being exploited. And then so that she can rewrite your motivations to make you seem as ridiculous as possible. Liana flattens things a lot. Liana changes motivations a lot. For example, Asher has wanted his episode, and It's Not Therapy, to be removed. You can find that episode everywhere. You can find it on Podbean. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. In the It's Not Therapy 3689 channel, it's the most popular episode of It's Not Therapy on that YouTube channel. However, Asher has stated multiple times that now he wants that episode taken down based on Liana's subsequent actions following the cancellation video. Because while she mines good faith from that episode, and prior to the rupture, Liana told Asher how popular the episode was and how appreciated it was because of his voice there and what he said, and which also allowed her to get more clients. The actions she has taken since, including constantly mentioning Asher's borderline personality disorder in the skeets, in which she ascribes all sorts of psychological motives to him, aimed at making him look as terrible as possible. Asher considers Liana Kerzner's maintaining of that episode, or at least his part in that episode, as exploitation of a mentally ill individual for gain, while also doing this to him. Now, Asher has laid out his reasons in a very eloquent post, and I'm including the post in the description of the video so you can go and read it for yourself, because I don't want to put words in his mouth. But go ahead and look at that post, give it a read, and again, Liana Kerzner's reasons that she has given you for Asher wanting to get that video taken down are very different from reality. The more you start getting accustomed to the notion that this is the case with a lot of things regarding Liana Kerzner, the sooner you're going to start noticing the patterns. Well, that's all. I hope you have a great weekend.